The distant mountains burned gold as the setting sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek. James Harker sat alone on the weathered porch of his modest ranch house, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth. His calloused hands worked methodically at cleaning his Colt revolver, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing over his 45 years of life. 20 of those years had been spent wandering from town to town across the unforgiving landscape of the American West, until finally, 3 years ago, he had purchased this small patch of land with savings from his days as a cattle driver. The lines etched deeply around his eyes spoke of harsh sun and harsher memories, while the slight gray at his temples hinted at wisdom hard-won through suffering. James had come to Redemption Creek seeking what had eluded him his entire life: peace, simplicity, and a chance to wash away the blood that seemed permanently stained into the creases of his hands. "Beautiful evening, ain't it?" The voice of Silas Montgomery, his nearest neighbor and the closest thing James had to a friend in these parts, interrupted his solitude. The older man ambled up the dirt path leading to the house, his bow-legged gait betraying decades spent in the saddle. Silas had taken a liking to the quiet newcomer, often stopping by with news from town or a bottle of whiskey to share as the evening shadows lengthened. Tonight, however, James could tell from the way Silas was shifting his weight from one foot to another that he hadn't come for casual conversation. "Town meeting tonight," Silas continued, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow with a faded bandana. "Sheriff wants every able man present. Says it's important. Something about the new school teacher arriving on tomorrow's stage." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, returning his attention to the revolver parts laid out on the cloth before him. School matters were of little concern to a man who had never learned to read beyond recognizing his own name. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. We always love to hear from our viewers. "Heard she's coming all the way from Boston," Silas pressed on, undeterred by James's silence. "Widow woman, they say. Name's Elizabeth Caldwell. Sheriff's worried about her adjusting to life out here. Wants to make sure she gets a proper welcome." The older man paused, studying James' impassive face. "Thought you might want to know, seeing as how your place sits on her route to the schoolhouse." James reassembled his revolver with practiced efficiency, the metal pieces clicking together with satisfying precision. He had deliberately chosen this isolated stretch of land to avoid exactly this kind of entanglement with town affairs. The last thing he wanted was to exchange pleasantries with some citified widow woman who would undoubtedly view him with the same mixture of fear and disapproval that most decent folk reserved for men with his background. "Appreciate the information," he finally responded, his voice rough from disuse. "But I've got cattle to tend come morning." Silas sighed, disappointment evident in his weathered face. "One of these days, James Harker, you're gonna have to stop hiding out here and rejoin the living." He replaced his hat, adjusting it against the last rays of the setting sun. "Sheriff also mentioned something about trouble brewing with the Blackwood gang. Word is they've been spotted near Taylor's Crossing, not 30 miles from here." This information caused James to pause, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly around the grip of his revolver. The Blackwood gang, a name he hadn't heard in nearly a decade, one he'd hoped never to hear again. Memories threatened to surface, gunshots echoing across a moonlit canyon, a woman's scream cut suddenly short, the metallic scent of blood mixing with desert dust. James forced the images back into the dark corners of his mind, where he kept them locked away. "That's so," he replied, his tone deliberately casual as he slipped the revolver into its holster. "Well, if they've got any sense, they'll pass right on through." As Silas disappeared down the path, James remained on the porch long after darkness had swallowed the landscape. The arrival of a schoolteacher would normally be of no consequence to him, but the mention of the Blackwood gang had stirred something he'd long tried to bury. Sleep would not come easily tonight. He rose stiffly, his old wound from a Comanche arrow throbbing slightly as it always did when rain was coming. Inside his sparse cabin, he lit a lamp and moved to a small wooden chest kept beneath his bed. The lock clicked open to reveal a few personal possessions. A faded daguerreotype of a woman whose features had grown indistinct with time. A silver pocket watch that hadn't ticked in 20 years. And wrapped in oilcloth, a sheriff's badge from a town that no longer existed. James touched none of these things, simply staring at them as though they belonged to another man entirely. A man who had died long ago in all the ways that mattered. Morning arrived with the promised rain, a gentle patter against the tin roof that would bring welcome relief to the parched land, but would make the roads treacherous with mud. James went about his chores methodically, feeding his small herd of cattle and repairing a section of fence damaged in the last windstorm. By midday, the rain had cleared, leaving behind the fresh, clean smell of wet earth and sage. He was returning from the north pasture when he spotted the stagecoach in the distance, making its laborious way along the muddy track that passed near his property. Ordinarily, he would have continued about his business, but something, perhaps Silas's words about the Blackwood gang, perhaps simple curiosity, made him pause. The stage was moving unusually slowly, and as it drew nearer, James could see it was listing badly to one side. His experienced eye immediately recognized the signs of a broken wheel axle, a common but dangerous occurrence on these poorly maintained roads. With a resigned sigh, James mounted his dun gelding and rode out to intercept the struggling vehicle. As he approached, he could see the driver struggling with the reins, attempting to keep the horses steady as the coach threatened to topple over entirely. "Whoa there," the driver called out, finally bringing the team to a halt. James dismounted and assessed the damage without speaking. The rear axle had indeed cracked, and the wheel was barely hanging on. The driver, a grizzled man whom James recognized from his infrequent trips into town, looked relieved to see him. "Mr. Harker, Providence, that's what this is. Don't know how much farther we'd have made it." James nodded curtly, already examining the extent of the damage. "Got a passenger, too," the driver continued. "The new schoolmarm from back east. Was hoping to get her to town before nightfall." As if summoned by the mention, the coach door opened and a woman emerged, carefully navigating the muddy ground with evident distaste. James froze, his back to her, suddenly reluctant to turn around. He had avoided close contact with respectable women for years, finding their fear or judgment more difficult to bear than any physical hardship. "Is there a problem with the coach?" The voice that posed the question was clear and educated, lacking the harsh edges of frontier speech, but there was a strength to it that surprised him. Slowly, James turned to face the new arrival. Elizabeth Caldwell was not what he had expected. Instead of the severe, middle-aged widow he had imagined, he found himself looking at a woman perhaps in her early 30s, dressed in a practical traveling suit of deep blue. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her eyes, a startling green, regarded him with intelligence and composure rather than fear. "Broken axle," James replied curtly, turning his attention back to the damaged coach. "Won't make it to town like this." The driver removed his hat nervously, looking between James and his passenger. "Mr. Harker's place is just over that rise, ma'am. Perhaps—" James cut him off with a sharp glance. "Having a stranger on his property especially a woman, was precisely the kind of complication he had structured his solitary life to avoid. But as dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, promising more rain before nightfall, he knew there were few options. "I can fix it," he said flatly, "but not before dark, and not in the rain." He paused, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "You can shelter at my place until morning. I'll have you on your way by first light." Mrs. Caldwell studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Harker. I accept your offer." The driver helped unload Mrs. Caldwell's trunk and carpet bag from the coach, promising to return the next day with the necessary parts to repair the axle. As the man departed on horseback toward town, James found himself alone with the schoolteacher, an awkward silence stretching between them. "If you'll follow me," he finally said, mounting his horse and reaching down to help her up behind him. She hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand in his and allowing him to pull her up onto the horse. The simple contact, even through layers of leather and fabric, sent an unexpected jolt through James's body. It had been so long since he had touched another human being with any purpose beyond necessity. Mrs. Caldwell settled behind him, maintaining a proper distance, her hands resting lightly on his waist. "I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Harker," she said as they set off toward his cabin. "I understand this is an imposition." James guided his horse carefully across the muddy terrain, acutely aware of his passenger's presence. "Not many options out here," he replied simply. They crested the small rise that concealed his property from the main road, and he felt, rather than heard, Mrs. Caldwell's small intake of breath as his ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A small cabin with a covered porch, a sturdy barn, and corrals for the cattle and horses. But he had built most of it with his own hands, and despite his reluctance to admit it, he felt a flicker of pride at what he had created here. "It's lovely," Mrs. Caldwell said softly, surprising him. "So peaceful." James made no response, unused to receiving compliments of any kind, let alone about his home. As they reached the cabin, dark clouds opened once more, and rain began to fall in earnest. They barely made it to the porch before the downpour became torrential, thunder rolling across the valley like distant cannon fire. Inside, James was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how sparse and masculine his living space was. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a bookshelf containing exactly 3 books he couldn't read, and in the corner, his narrow bed with its patchwork quilt, the only splash of color in the room. "It's not much," he said gruffly, lighting the lamp on the table. Mrs. Caldwell removed her damp cloak, revealing the simple elegance of her traveling suit beneath. "It's a home, Mr. Harker," she replied, her green eyes taking in every detail. "That's more than many have." There was something in her tone, a hint of personal knowledge about loss, that made James look at her more closely. This woman had known hardship, despite her refined appearance. The realization made him unexpectedly curious about her story, a feeling he quickly suppressed. Getting to know people meant letting them get to know you, and that was a risk he wasn't willing to take. "I'll prepare something to eat," he said, moving to the stove to escape the sudden intimacy of the moment. "You can take the bed tonight. I'll sleep in the barn." Mrs. Caldwell looked as though she might protest, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she moved to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. "Have you lived here long, Mr. Harker?" she asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. James busied himself with lighting the stove and preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. 3 years, he answered, surprising himself with his willingness to engage in conversation. Came here from Wyoming territory. He offered no further details, and to his relief, she didn't press for more. Instead, she moved away from the window and approached the bookshelf, examining the 3 leather-bound volumes with interest. Moby Dick, the Bible, and Shakespeare's collected works, she noted. An interesting collection. James felt heat rise to his face as he stirred the beans. They belonged to a friend, he said shortly. Don't have much use for them myself. He wouldn't tell her that he kept them as a reminder of a debt he could never repay. A debt to a man who had once believed James could be more than what his violent past had made him. Mrs. Caldwell seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. I understand from the town's letters that there are 15 children enrolled in the school, she said, seating herself at the table. Some coming from as far as 10 miles away. James nodded, grateful for the shift to impersonal topics. Mostly ranch children, he confirmed. A few from the mining camp to the west. He served the simple meal on tin plates, then, as an afterthought, retrieved a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet. For the chill, he explained, pouring a small amount into a cup and offering it to her. To his surprise, Mrs. Caldwell accepted the whiskey without hesitation, taking a small sip before setting the cup aside. I'm afraid proper Boston ladies aren't supposed to enjoy spirits, she said with the faintest hint of a smile. But I found that proper Boston ladies miss out on rather a lot of life's experiences. There was something in her tone, a subtle defiance, perhaps, that caught James' attention. This woman was more complex than the simple stereotype of an Eastern schoolmarm he had initially assigned to her. They ate in relative silence, the pounding rain and occasional thunder providing a natural backdrop to the meal. As James cleared away the plates, Mrs. Caldwell rose and moved again to the window, her posture betraying a tension that hadn't been present before. Do you get many visitors out here, Mr. Harker? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. The question seemed odd, and James paused in his task. No, he replied slowly, watching her. Nearest neighbor is Silas Montgomery, about 2 miles east. Why do you ask? Mrs. Caldwell turned from the window, her face composed, but her eyes troubled. I thought I saw movement near the tree line, she said. A flash of light, perhaps, like sunlight on metal. James' hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. Years of survival on the frontier had taught him to trust such observations, especially from someone who had no reason to be jumpy about ordinary ranch sounds. Without comment, he extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the stove. Moving silently to the window, he positioned himself to see out while remaining hidden from outside view. For several long minutes, he saw nothing beyond the rain-drenched landscape and was about to dismiss her concern when he caught it. A brief glint of light where no light should be, at the edge of the tree line, approximately 100 yards from the cabin. Stay away from the windows, he instructed quietly, his mind rapidly assessing possible threats. Random bandits were unlikely to be out in such weather, and Indians rarely traveled these parts anymore, which left the possibility that had been nagging at him since Silas's visit, the Blackwood Gang. But why would they come here, to his isolated ranch? Unless, James glanced at Mrs. Caldwell, who was watching him with evident concern but remarkable composure. Mrs. Caldwell, he said carefully, is there something you're not telling me about why you've come to Redemption Creek? The schoolteacher's expression flickered briefly, her composure cracking just enough to confirm his suspicion before she regained control. "I'm simply a widow seeking a fresh start, Mr. Harker," she replied evenly. "The school board was kind enough to offer me the position." James considered pressing further, but was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of horses approaching, multiple riders, moving slowly, deliberately, despite the rain. "Get down," he ordered, guiding Mrs. Caldwell to the floor, beside the heavy oak table. He retrieved his Winchester rifle from beside the door, checking that it was loaded. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Moving to the door, James extinguished the last light in the stove, leaving the cabin in complete darkness. He slipped outside onto the porch, pressing himself against the wall where the shadows were deepest. The riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond clear visibility in the rain and gathering darkness. James counted 5 distinct shapes, 5 riders sitting motionless, watching the cabin. A 6th figure separated from the group, urging his horse forward a few paces. "James Harker!" The voice that carried across the rain-soaked yard was one James had hoped never to hear again. "Been a long time, old friend." Frank Blackwood's distinctive Mississippi drawl hadn't changed in the decades since James had last heard it. "We know you're there, James, and we know you've got something that belongs to us." James remained perfectly still, his mind racing. What could he possibly have that would bring Blackwood and his gang out on a night like this? The answer came in a sudden, chilling realization as he thought of the woman hiding inside his cabin. Whatever her real story was, Elizabeth Caldwell had brought trouble to his doorstep, trouble with connections to a past he had spent years trying to escape. "Come on out, James," Blackwood called again. "Let's talk like civilized men, for old time's sake." Old times. The words triggered a flood of unwanted memories. Riding with the Blackwood gang in his younger, wilder days. The bank robbery in Silver Creek that had gone horribly wrong. His decision to walk away from that life, and Frank Blackwood's vow that no one left the gang except in a pine box. James had escaped only because a young sheriff had given him a chance at redemption, the same sheriff whose badge now lay in the chest beneath his bed. "I've got nothing of yours, Frank," James called back, his voice carrying through the rain. "Best you and your boys move on." A harsh laugh answered him. "Now, James, we both know that's not true. The lady inside, she's carrying something that belongs to me, something very valuable." James felt a cold anger building inside him. Whatever Mrs. Caldwell might be hiding, he wouldn't hand over a woman to Frank Blackwood. He'd seen firsthand what happened to those who crossed the gang leader. "There's no one here but me, Frank," James replied, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. "And I'm not looking for trouble." Another laugh from Blackwood, followed by a signal to his men, who began to spread out along the tree line. "Trouble's already found you, old friend. Send the widow out with my property, and we'll be on our way. Refuse and, well, I'm afraid we'll have to come in and get her ourselves." James weighed his options quickly. 5 against 1 were poor odds, even with the advantage of defending the cabin. And he still had no idea what property of Blackwood's Mrs. Caldwell supposedly possessed. Moving carefully back inside, he found the schoolteacher exactly where he'd left her, though she had armed herself with his spare revolver, holding it with surprising confidence for a Boston schoolmarm. "You've heard?" he asked quietly, crouching beside her in the darkness. She nodded, her face pale but determined in the faint light coming through the window. "Mr. Harker, I need to explain." He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Later. Right now, we need to get out of here." He moved to the back of the cabin, pulling up a trapdoor hidden beneath a small rug. "Root cellar," he explained. "Connects to a tunnel that comes out near the creek. Dug it my first year here. Old habits." The look of surprised respect in her eyes was something he would have appreciated under different circumstances. "Take only what you absolutely need," he instructed, already gathering ammunition and a canteen of water. "We'll head for town once we're clear." "Mrs. Caldwell hesitated only briefly before removing something from inside her bodice, a small leather pouch that she clutched tightly in her hand. As they prepared to descend into the cellar, a shot rang out, splintering the window frame. "They're coming in," James said grimly, helping Mrs. Caldwell down the crude ladder. "Stay ahead of me. Follow the tunnel straight to the end. Don't stop for anything." He followed her down, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and stored vegetables. James lit a small lantern he kept there, revealing a low, narrow tunnel barely big enough for a man to crawl through. "It's about 50 yards, he whispered. "Gets tight in the middle, Mrs." Caldwell nodded, tucking the mysterious pouch securely into her pocket before dropping to her hands and knees and beginning to crawl. James extinguished the lantern. They would have to navigate by touch alone, and followed, pulling the entrance to the tunnel closed behind him. They had covered perhaps half the distance when the muffled sound of boots on the cabin floor above reached them, followed by angry shouts as the intruders discovered their quarry had escaped. "They'll find the trapdoor soon enough," James breathed, urging Mrs. Caldwell to move faster. The tunnel grew narrower, forcing them to wriggle on their bellies through a section where the earth had partially collapsed. James could feel claustrophobia threatening to overwhelm him, but he forced it down, focusing on the steady movement of the woman ahead of him. Finally, the tunnel began to widen again, and soon Mrs. Caldwell was pulling herself up into the small cave-like opening near the creek bank. James emerged behind her, immediately scanning their surroundings for danger. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted enough to allow moonlight to illuminate the landscape. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward a small stand of cottonwoods where he had tied his second horse, an insurance policy from his outlaw days that had now proven its worth. The black mare nickered softly as they approached. James quickly checked the saddlebags, containing emergency provisions and ammunition, before helping Mrs. Caldwell mount. He swung up behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. "We'll have to ride double," he said, his voice low, near her ear, quieter than two horses. She nodded, her body tense but cooperative as he urged the mare forward at a cautious walk, keeping to the soft ground near the creek where their tracks would be harder to follow. Only when they had put a good half-mile between themselves and the cabin did James permit himself to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "What is it that Blackwood wants from you so badly, Mrs. Caldwell? And I think it's time you drop the pretense. No Boston schoolteacher handles a revolver like you did back there." For a long moment, she was silent, and James could feel the internal debate raging within her. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly beneath his arms. "My real name is Elizabeth Caldwell," she began, her voice barely audible above the gentle splashing of the creek beside them. "That much is true. But I was never a schoolteacher. I worked for Pinkerton's detective agency." James nearly pulled the horse to a halt in surprise, but managed to maintain their steady pace. Pinkerton agents were legendary and controversial figures in the West, hired by wealthy Easterners to protect their interests in mining, railroads, and banking. That a woman would be employed by the agency was unusual, but not unheard of. I was assigned to infiltrate the Blackwood gang, she continued. They had robbed 3 banks connected to my employer, the Western Union Bank of Denver. I posed as a widow with a small inheritance, staying at boarding houses along their known route. James listened intently, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. You got close to Blackwood, he surmised, feeling her slight nod of confirmation. Close enough that he trusted me, she admitted. Or at least, trusted me more than most. Enough to learn about their next target, a gold shipment coming from the Redemption Creek mine. James knew the shipment she referred to. The entire town had been buzzing about the successful strike at the old mine. And the first major shipment was due to leave within the week. So you took something of his, he prompted. Something valuable enough that he's willing to track you across 3 states. Mrs. Caldwell reached into her pocket and withdrew the small leather pouch she had been guarding so carefully. She handed it to James, who opened it one-handed, still controlling the horse with his other. Inside was a folded piece of paper, covered in what appeared to be a complex series of numbers and letters. The cipher, she explained. Blackwood's entire operation depends on coded messages between gang members and corrupt officials who tip them off about shipments. It took me months to get close enough to steal this. James studied the paper in the moonlight, understanding dawning on him. With this cipher, law enforcement could decode intercepted messages, effectively dismantling Blackwood's entire network. And Redemption Creek? He asked, returning the pouch to her. Why come here instead of taking this directly to your employers in Denver? Mrs. Caldwell hesitated again. Because of a name I found in Blackwood's private correspondence, she finally said. A name that appeared repeatedly in connection with the Redemption Creek job. She turned slightly in the saddle, looking up at him with those remarkable green eyes. Your name, Mr. Harker. The words hit James like a physical blow. That's impossible, he said flatly. I haven't had contact with Blackwood or his gang in over 10 years. But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. Could someone have used his name? Or was there something more sinister at work? Nevertheless, Mrs. Caldwell persisted. Your name was there. I came to Redemption Creek to find out why, to determine if you were working with Blackwood again, or if someone was using your reputation for their own purposes. The implication stung, but James could hardly blame her for her suspicions given his past. And what did you conclude? He asked, his voice carefully neutral, as they continued their cautious progress through the moonlit landscape. Before tonight, I mean. I concluded that either you were an excellent actor, she replied after a thoughtful pause, or you were exactly what you appeared to be, a man who had left his past behind and wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The simple truth of her assessment caught James off guard. Few people had ever seen past his carefully constructed walls to the core of who he was, or rather, who he was trying to become. So the school teacher position is, he prompted. A convenient cover, she confirmed. The real teacher was delayed in Denver. I arranged to take her place temporarily, giving me time to investigate the connection between you and Blackwood before the gold shipment leaves. James processed this information, his mind already working on their next steps. We need to get to town, he decided. Warn the sheriff about Blackwood's plans. As they crested a small rise, the lights of Redemption Creek came into view in the distance. A small cluster of golden pinpricks in the vast darkness of the frontier night. James guided the mare onto the main road, judging that speed now outweighed the need for stealth. Can I trust you, Mrs. Caldwell? He asked suddenly, the question arising from some deep instinct. Or is there more to this story that you haven't told me?" She was silent for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice held a note of vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "You can trust that I want to stop Blackwood," she said carefully. "Beyond that, we all have secrets, Mr. Harker, even Pinkerton agents." The cryptic response didn't entirely satisfy him, but he recognized the truth in her words. Everyone on the frontier carried secrets, himself most of all. They rode in silence for several minutes, the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves on the packed dirt road the only noise in the still night air. James was acutely aware of Elizabeth's proximity, the warmth of her body against his chest, the faint scent of lavender that somehow lingered despite their desperate escape through the muddy tunnel. Something about this woman stirred feelings he had long thought dead: curiosity, respect, and something more dangerous that he refused to name. "They'll be following our trail," he said, forcing his mind back to the practical matters at hand. "We have maybe an hour's lead. Less if they picked up our tracks quickly." Elizabeth nodded, her practical nature reasserting itself. "We should split up when we reach town," she suggested. "I'll take the cipher to Sheriff Mills while you warn the mine owners about the planned robbery." The sensible plan highlighted the unspoken question between them. What would happen after they had delivered their warnings? Would Elizabeth return to Denver with her evidence, her brief connection to James Harker becoming nothing more than a footnote in an official report? The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. "Blackwood won't give up easily," he warned, pushing aside these uncomfortable reflections. "Even if we manage to prevent the robbery, he'll want revenge on both of us." Elizabeth's posture stiffened slightly at his words. "I'm aware of the risks, Mr. Harker," she replied, a hint of steel returning to her voice. "I've been dealing with men like Frank Blackwood my entire career." But there was something in her tone, a barely perceptible tremor, that made James wonder if she was truly as confident as she appeared. They were within a mile of town when James abruptly reined the mare to a halt, his senses on high alert. "What is it?" Elizabeth whispered, her body tensing against his. "Listen," he murmured, holding his breath. At first, there was only silence. But then, carried on the night breeze, came the distant sound of multiple horses moving at a steady trot. "Blackwood," James hissed, immediately guiding their mount off the road and into a dense thicket of scrub oak. "They've cut around ahead of us." This development changed everything. If Blackwood's men had circled ahead to cut off the road to town, their options were severely limited. "How did they know?" Elizabeth wondered aloud, her voice tight with frustration. "How could they possibly have guessed we'd head for town?" James's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Someone in town must be working with them, he concluded grimly. Someone who knew to watch the road. The implications of this realization settled over them like a physical weight. If Blackwood had allies in Redemption Creek, nowhere in town would be truly safe. "We need a new plan," James said, guiding the mare deeper into the thicket, away from both the road and the approaching riders. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles northwest of here, used by cattle drivers during roundup. We can hole up there until morning, then circle around to the mine itself." Elizabeth nodded her agreement, and James could feel some of the tension leave her body as she adjusted to the new plan. "And then?" she asked quietly. "After we warn them?" James had been avoiding this question, even in his own mind. The safest course would be for them to part ways, Elizabeth taking her evidence back to Denver, while he, what? Returned to his ruined ranch? Moved on to yet another frontier town where no one knew his name or history? "One problem at a time," he replied gruffly, unable or unwilling to contemplate a future beyond their immediate survival. The line shack proved to be exactly as James remembered it, a crude, one-room structure built of logs and roofed with split shingles, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines. He approached cautiously, rifle at the ready, but the shack appeared deserted. Inside, a rough wooden table, 2 stools, and a narrow cot with a moth-eaten blanket comprised the entirety of the furnishings. "It's not much," James acknowledged as he lit the stub of a candle he found on a shelf, "but it's dry and no one's likely to look for us here." Elizabeth moved around the small space, her practical nature evidently assessing and adapting to their situation. "It's perfect," she said simply, removing her damp cloak and hanging it near the small stone fireplace. James hesitated, then set about making a small fire, more for light than warmth in the mild spring night. As the flames caught and began to illuminate the shack more fully, he found himself studying Elizabeth covertly. Away from the immediate danger, he could see the toll their escape had taken on her. Her chestnut hair had come partially loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of dirt across one cheek. Yet there was a dignity to her bearing, a quiet strength that commanded respect. "You should rest," he suggested, gesturing to the narrow cot. "I'll keep watch." Elizabeth shook her head, seating herself on one of the stools. "I have questions, Mr. Harker," she said directly, "and I think it's time I had some answers." James stiffened, his instinct for privacy warring with the knowledge that this woman had risked her life based partly on suspicions about him. She deserved at least some measure of truth. "What do you want to know?" he asked, leaning his rifle against the wall and taking the other stool. Elizabeth studied him thoughtfully, seeming to choose her words with care. "Your connection to the Blackwood gang," she began. "You said it's been 10 years. What happened?" James stared into the small fire, memories he'd long suppressed rising unbidden to the surface. "I rode with them for 2 years, he admitted, his voice low. "I was young, angry, with nowhere to go after the war. Frank Blackwood offered good money and a sense of belonging." He paused, the flames casting shifting shadows across his weathered face. "Until Silver Creek." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "The bank robbery," she said. 3 people died." James closed his eyes briefly, the images still vivid after all these years. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Frank shot the teller when she screamed, then the guard. The third was a little girl who just happened to be there with her father." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of his confession. "You left after that," Elizabeth prompted gently. James nodded. "Rode out that night. Didn't even take my share of the money. Just wanted to be clean of it." He didn't tell her about the weeks that followed, the drinking, the nightmares, the overwhelming guilt that had nearly driven him to put a bullet in his own head. "But Frank found you," she guessed, and he could hear the professional detective connecting the pieces of his story. "Eventually," James confirmed. "A year later, in a mining town in Colorado. Would have killed me too, if not for the sheriff there. Man named Thomas Garrett." He glanced at her to see if the name meant anything to her. When she showed no recognition, he continued. "Garrett had been tracking the Blackwood gang for months. He offered me a deal, help him bring them down, and he'd see I got a second chance." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. "You became an informant," she realized. James nodded grimly. "Or 2 years. I fed Garrett information, helped him disrupt their operations. We managed to catch 3 of the gang, but Frank always slipped away. His hand unconsciously moved to his side, where an old scar marked the price of his betrayal. Until one night, Frank figured out I was the leak, set a trap. Garrett died saving my life. The last words came out rough, with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. I took his badge afterward, kept it as a reminder of my debt. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, processing his story. "And you've been running ever since," she finally said, understanding rather than judgment in her voice, "until you found Redemption Creek." James looked up at her, struck by how accurately she had read him. "Thought I'd finally found a place where the past couldn't find me," he admitted. "Seems I was wrong." The vulnerability of the moment hung between them, unexpected and profound. Then, with a gentleness that startled him, Elizabeth reached across the small space and placed her hand over his. The simple touch, skin against skin, with no gloves or barriers between them, sent a jolt through James's body unlike anything he had experienced in years. It wasn't merely physical. It was as though something long dormant within him had suddenly awakened, responding to her touch like dry earth to the first drops of rain after a drought. For a brief, disorienting moment, he felt completely exposed. Not just his history, but something deeper, more essential, that he had protected fiercely for most of his adult life. He pulled his hand away reflexively, rising to check the door and window, needing distance from the unsettling intimacy of the moment. "We should both get some rest," he said, his voice deliberately gruff. "Long day ahead tomorrow." Elizabeth watched him, those remarkable green eyes seeing far too much. "Of course," she agreed softly, moving to the cot. As she arranged the thin blanket, James took up position near the window, rifle across his knees. "I'll wake you in a few hours to take your turn at watch," he said, though in truth he had no intention of sleeping. Not with Blackwood's men potentially searching for them, and certainly not with his thoughts in such turmoil. Elizabeth lay down, her back to him, but her voice drifted through the dim light of the cabin. "Thank you, James," she said quietly, the first time she had used his given name. "Not just for today, for telling me the truth." He made no reply, but in the silence that followed, something fundamental had shifted between them. A connection formed that transcended their desperate circumstances. Outside, an owl called into the night, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead as James Harker contemplated the strange twist of fate that had brought Elizabeth Caldwell into his life. And with her, the past he had tried so hard to escape. Morning arrived with pale golden light filtering through the single small window of the line shack. Despite his intention to remain vigilant through the night, James had eventually succumbed to exhaustion, dozing fitfully while seated against the wall. He awoke to find Elizabeth already up, her hair neatly arranged and her clothing brushed clean of the previous day's dust and grime. She had somehow managed to heat water over the dying embers of their fire and was using a handkerchief to wash her face. "You should have woken me," James said, immediately alert and checking their surroundings through the window. Elizabeth gave him a measured look. "You needed the rest," she replied simply, "and I'm perfectly capable of keeping watch." There was no reproach in her tone, merely a statement of fact, and James found himself respecting her pragmatism. This was a woman who understood survival, perhaps not in the same harsh environments he had navigated, but survival nonetheless. They shared a meager breakfast of jerky from James's saddlebags, planning their next move in low voices. "The mine is about 5 miles west of here," James explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt floor of the shack. "Most direct route would take us too close to town. We'll need to circle north, through the high country." Elizabeth studied his improvised map with focused attention. "And once we reach the mine?" she asked. James considered their limited options. "Bradley Morgan runs the operation," he said. "Don't know him well, but he's got a reputation for being straight. If we can convince him of the threat, he'll have men and weapons to help defend the shipment." What he didn't say, what both of them surely understood, was that their warning might well be met with skepticism. A drifter with a questionable past and a woman claiming to be a Pinkerton agent would not automatically command trust, especially with accusations against respected townspeople potentially involved. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth suddenly placed a hand on James's arm, stopping him. "There's something else you should know," she said, her expression grave. "Something I didn't tell you last night." James felt a familiar wariness return, his momentary trust receding. "What?" he asked flatly. Elizabeth withdrew a folded paper. James scanned the list quickly, his expression darkening as he recognized several prominent citizens, including Silas Montgomery, the neighbor he had considered a friend. "Silas," he muttered, the betrayal cutting unexpectedly deep. "That's how they found us so quickly. He must have told them about the schoolteacher staying at my place." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "And the sheriff is on this list too," she pointed out, her finger indicating the name near the bottom. "Which is why we can't go directly to him with the warning." This complicated their situation significantly. If both his neighbor and the town's law enforcement were working with Blackwood, their options for allies were severely limited. "Morgan isn't on here," James noted, referring to the mine owner. "Nor is Reverend Adams or Doc Sullivan. These might be the only people in town they could trust, if they could reach them without being spotted by Blackwood's men or their collaborators in Redemption Creek." "Let's move," he said decisively, checking his revolver and rifle one final time. "Stay close and keep your eyes open. Trust no one we meet on the trail." Elizabeth folded the paper and returned it to its hiding place, her expression resolute. "No one except each other," she added quietly, her green eyes meeting his with an unspoken question. The implication hung between them. Did they truly trust each other, despite their brief acquaintance and the secrets both still undoubtedly kept? James hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Accept each other," he confirmed, the words feeling strangely significant as they left his mouth. Whatever else happened, their fates were now intertwined, bound together by shared danger and unexpected connection. They left the line shack cautiously, James leading the mare through the dense pine forest rather than mounting, both to leave less obvious tracks and to maintain silence. The morning was clear and cool, birds calling from the treetops in cheerful ignorance of the human drama unfolding beneath them. As they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain, James found himself repeatedly glancing at Elizabeth, impressed by her sure-footed progress and lack of complaint despite the difficult conditions. This was no delicate Eastern flower, but a woman of remarkable resilience and determination. After nearly 2 hours of steady travel, they reached a vantage point that offered a clear view of the Redemption Creek mine in the valley below. The operation was larger than James had realized, with several wooden structures clustered around the main shaft and men moving purposefully between buildings. "There's Morgan," James murmured, pointing to a tall figure in a black coat speaking with a group of miners. "We'll approach from the east side, where there's more cover." Elizabeth nodded, but her attention had shifted to something else, a plume of dust rising from the direction of town. "Riders coming," she observed, her voice tense. "At least 6 of them." James quickly assessed their situation. The riders would reach the mine well before they could make their way down the steep slope to warn Morgan. "Change of plan," he decided grimly. "We need to get there first." Leading Elizabeth to where he had tethered the mare, James helped her mount quickly. "Hold tight," he instructed, swinging up behind her and urging the horse forward at a dangerous pace down the rocky slope. The mare responded admirably, picking her way with sure-footed precision despite the treacherous terrain. As they approached the mine, shouts of alarm rose from the workers who spotted their precipitous descent. By the time they reached level ground, several armed men had formed a defensive line, rifles pointed in their direction. "That's far enough," called one of the miners, a burly man with a shotgun. "State your business." James reined the mare to a halt, carefully keeping his hands visible. "Need to speak with Bradley Morgan," he called back. "It's urgent, matter of life and death." The standoff lasted several tense moments before the tall figure James had identified as Morgan stepped forward. "I know you," the mine owner said, studying James with narrowed eyes. "Harker, isn't it? The rancher from north of town." James nodded, keeping his voice level. "Mr. Morgan, there's no time to explain everything. Frank Blackwood and his gang are planning to rob your gold shipment. They have collaborators in town, including Sheriff Mills." Morgan's expression remained skeptical, but he motioned for his men to lower their weapons slightly. "That's a serious accusation, Harker. What proof do you have?" Before James could respond, Elizabeth spoke up, her clear, educated voice carrying authority, despite their disheveled appearance. "I'm Elizabeth Caldwell, agent with Pinkerton Detective Agency. I've been tracking Blackwood's operations for months. I have documented evidence of his plans and his Confederates in Redemption Creek." The mention of the Pinkerton Agency clearly carried weight with Morgan, whose demeanor shifted subtly. "Come inside," he decided, gesturing toward the main office building. "Quickly now." As they dismounted, James caught sight of the dust cloud growing larger. The riders from town were approaching rapidly. "We have company coming," he warned, "and I doubt they're friendly." Morgan barked orders to his men, who immediately took up defensive positions around the perimeter of the mine complex. Inside the office, a surprisingly well-appointed room with maps and ledgers neatly organized on shelves, Morgan closed the door and turned to them expectantly. "Let's see this evidence of yours," he said directly. Elizabeth produced both the cipher and the list of names, explaining their significance while James kept watch through the window. Morgan examined the documents with careful attention, his expression growing darker as he read the list of collaborators. "Johnson, my own foreman," he muttered, pointing to a name James hadn't recognized. "I've suspected he might be feeding information to someone." He looked up at Elizabeth with new respect. "If this is authentic, I owe you a debt of gratitude, Miss Caldwell. We're shipping out nearly 50,000 in gold tomorrow." The sum was staggering, more than most men would see in a lifetime. No wonder Blackwood had gone to such lengths to set up this robbery. "The riders are almost here," James reported from his position at the window. "I count 8 men. Blackwood's in the lead, with Sheriff Mills beside him." Morgan's face hardened at this confirmation of the sheriff's betrayal. "Well then," he said grimly, "I believe it's time we had a reckoning." What followed was a tense negotiation conducted at shouting distance, with Blackwood and his men remaining on horseback at the edge of the mine property, while Morgan, James, and a dozen armed miners faced them from the buildings. Elizabeth had remained inside the office at James's insistence, though she had done so reluctantly and only after he had promised that Morgan's men would protect her if things went badly. "You're harboring fugitives, Morgan," Blackwood called, his Mississippi drawl carrying across the open ground. "That woman's a thief, and Harker's an accomplice. Turn them over, and we'll be on our way." Morgan, standing steadily beside James, responded with surprising calm. "Seems to me she's a Pinkerton agent doing her job, Frank. And as for what she stole, well, I've seen it now. Interesting reading, especially the part about tomorrow's shipment." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackwood's face, visible even at this distance. Beside him, Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "This doesn't concern you, Morgan," the sheriff called. "Just hand over the woman and whatever she took from Mr. Blackwood. This is a legal matter." Morgan's laugh was cold and without humor. "Legal? Like the legal arrangement you had to let Blackwood rob my mine? Or the legal way you've been taking my money while planning to let bandits steal my gold?" The sheriff's face darkened, with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "You've got no proof of any such nonsense," he blustered, but his hand had moved tellingly toward his revolver. James tensed, sensing the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one hasty word, and bullets would fly. Blackwood, ever the calculating strategist, recognized the deteriorating situation. "Seems we've reached an impasse," he called, his tone deceptively casual. "Perhaps we should all take some time to consider our positions. After all, there are complications that Mr. Morgan may not be aware of." His eyes fixed on James with malicious intent. "Ask your new friend Harker about Silver Creek sometime. Ask him whose gun killed that little girl." James felt as though he'd been physically struck, the old guilt rushing back with paralyzing force. Morgan glanced at him questioningly, but James kept his eyes fixed on Blackwood, refusing to show the effect of the outlaw's words. "We're done talking, Frank," he called steadily. "Ride away while you still can." Blackwood's face twisted with rage, but after a tense moment, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Harker," he shouted over his shoulder as he and his men retreated toward town. Not by a long shot. As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, James felt the tension drain from his body, leaving him unexpectedly weak. Morgan was watching him with a measuring gaze. "There a truth to what he said?" the mine owner asked quietly. James met his eyes directly. "Yes," he admitted, "but not the way he tells it. That's a conversation for another time." Morgan nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. "Well, you've earned the right to tell your side when you're ready," he acknowledged. "For now, we need to prepare. Blackwood won't give up easily. Not with 50,000 in gold at stake." James agreed, already thinking through the likely approaches Blackwood would take. "He'll wait for dark," he predicted. "Try to catch us by surprise. How many men can you trust?" Morgan considered the question carefully. 20, maybe 25 who aren't on that list of yours. Good men, most with military experience from the war. Inside the office, James found Elizabeth studying the mine's layout maps with focused intensity. She looked up as he entered, relief evident in her eyes, though she quickly masked it. "What happened?" she asked. James gave her a brief account of the confrontation, noting how her expression darkened at the mention of Blackwood's parting threat. "He won't stop," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Not until he has the cipher back and—" She hesitated, glancing toward Morgan, who had followed James inside. "And both of us dead," James finished bluntly. "I know." The reality of their situation hung heavily in the room. Even if they successfully defended the gold shipment, Blackwood's vengeance would follow them. For James, who had spent years looking over his shoulder, it was a familiar burden. For Elizabeth, despite her dangerous profession, it represented a new level of personal threat. "The immediate problem is defending the shipment," Morgan interjected practically. "Miss Caldwell, Your expertise would be valuable in anticipating Blackwood's tactics. Elizabeth nodded, turning back to the maps. Based on his past operations, he'll likely split his forces, she analyzed. A frontal distraction, while a smaller group attempts to access the gold from an unexpected direction. Her finger traced a line across the map. The creek bed here provides cover nearly to the assay office where you're keeping the gold. I'd position men there, out of sight. James studied the map, impressed by her tactical thinking. And here, he added, indicating another vulnerable approach. The old drainage tunnel. If they've got Johnson's information, they'll know about it. Morgan nodded grimly. We'll seal it immediately and post guards. As the afternoon progressed, the mine transformed into a fortress. Morgan's trusted men were armed and positioned at strategic points. The gold was moved to a more defensible location, and lookouts were posted on the surrounding hillsides. James found himself working alongside Elizabeth as they checked positions and finalized plans, their partnership becoming more natural with each passing hour. During a brief moment alone, as they verified the barricades at the main entrance, Elizabeth touched his arm lightly. What Blackwood said about Silver Creek, she began hesitantly. You don't have to explain. James cut her off gently. It's the truth, he said, needing her to understand. I was there. My gun was fired, but it wasn't me who pulled the trigger. The weight of this confession, carried for so many years, seemed lighter somehow in the telling. Frank took my revolver during the robbery, used it to shoot the guard. I didn't know until later, when Sheriff Garrett showed me the bullet they'd recovered. Elizabeth's green eyes held his, searching for the truth. You've carried that guilt all these years, she said softly, understanding rather than judgment in her voice. For something you didn't do. James shook his head slightly. I was there, he repeated. I helped plan the robbery. Maybe I didn't pull the trigger, but I'm not innocent. The distinction seemed important, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Elizabeth considered this, then nodded slowly. There are different kinds of guilt, she acknowledged, and different kinds of redemption. Before James could respond to this unexpected insight, a shout from one of the lookouts interrupted them. Rider coming! Single horseman from the east. James immediately moved to a position where he could observe the approaching figure, Elizabeth close behind him. To his astonishment, the lone rider was Silas Montgomery, his neighbor and the man whose name had appeared on Elizabeth's list of Blackwood's collaborators. It's a trap, Elizabeth whispered urgently. He's trying to draw us out. But something in Silas's demeanor, the slumped posture, the slow pace of his horse, made James hesitate. Maybe, he conceded, but I want to hear what he has to say. Over Elizabeth's protests and Morgan's caution, James approached the perimeter fence, where Silas had reined his horse to a halt. The older man looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled. James, he called, his voice carrying a note of desperation. I need to speak with you, alone. James kept his hand near his revolver, maintaining a safe distance. Give me one reason why I should trust you, Silas, he replied coldly. Your name was on Blackwood's payroll list. Silas flinched as though struck. I know, he admitted, his shoulders sagging further, and I've been taking his money. But I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Especially not you, James. The words might have been convincing if James hadn't spent years learning to read men's intentions. There was something off in Silas's manner, a tension that belied his appearance of regret. What does Blackwood want? James demanded, cutting to the heart of the matter. Silas glanced nervously over his shoulder. He sent me to negotiate, he explained quickly. Says he'll leave the gold shipment alone if you and the woman hand over the cipher and leave Redemption Creek for good. No bloodshed necessary. The offer was suspiciously reasonable, setting off alarm bells in James' mind. And why would Frank suddenly become so accommodating? He asked skeptically. He's never been one to compromise. Silas licked his lips nervously. The woman complicated things, he admitted. Pinkerton involvement makes everything more dangerous for him. He's cutting his losses. James didn't believe it for a second. Tell Frank that his offer is declined, he said firmly. The cipher stays with us, and so does the gold. As he turned to walk away, Silas called after him, an edge of panic in his voice. He'll kill you for this, James. You and the woman both. James paused, looking back at his former friend with a mixture of pity and disgust. He can try, he replied simply, returning to where Elizabeth and Morgan waited anxiously. It's as we thought, he confirmed. Blackwood's planning something. That offer was too easy. He's trying to distract us from his real move. Morgan nodded grimly. We'll double the watch and check all positions again. It's going to be a long night. As darkness fell, an unnatural quiet settled over the mine complex. The usual evening activities, men playing cards or sharing tales over coffee, had been replaced by tense vigilance as armed miners watched from concealed positions. James and Elizabeth remained in Morgan's office, reviewing plans one final time by lamplight. You should get some rest, James suggested, noting the fatigue evident in Elizabeth's face despite her efforts to hide it. The attack won't come until well after midnight. She shook her head stubbornly. I'll rest when this is over, she insisted, when Blackwood is either dead or in custody. The determination in her voice was admirable, but James recognized the personal stake that drove it. This was more than a professional assignment for her now. Blackwood had made it personal by hunting her across 3 states, threatening her life, forcing her to rely on a stranger with a questionable past. Why did you become a Pinkerton agent? James asked suddenly, the question arising from genuine curiosity rather than tactical consideration. Elizabeth looked surprised by the personal nature of the query, especially given their circumstances. For a moment, he thought she might deflect or refuse to answer, but then her expression softened slightly. My father was a bank manager in Chicago, she explained, her voice quiet in the lamp-lit room. He was killed during a robbery when I was 16. The men who did it were never caught. The simple tragedy of her story resonated painfully with James's own experiences. So you hunt men like them now, he concluded softly. Men like I used to be. The words hung between them, a reminder of the gulf that should have separated them. Former outlaw and law enforcer. 2 people who by all rights should stand on opposite sides of a divide. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. The difference, she said with quiet certainty, is that you chose to change. Most never do. The simple observation cut through years of self-recrimination, offering a perspective James had never fully considered. Before he could respond, however, a soft bird call sounded from outside, the signal they had arranged with Morgan's men to indicate approaching danger. James immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the office into darkness, broken only by slivers of moonlight through the shuttered windows. It's starting, he whispered, drawing his revolver. Elizabeth did the same, moving with practiced efficiency to a position beside the door. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the distant hoot of an owl. Then, from the direction of the main shaft, came the unmistakable crack of rifle fire, followed almost immediately by shouts and the sounds of men running. The distraction, Elizabeth murmured. remaining disciplined at her post rather than rushing toward the commotion. James nodded, his senses straining to detect any sound from their sector of the complex, the administrative buildings where Morgan had relocated the gold. The minutes stretched endlessly, punctuated by ongoing gunfire from the opposite side of the mine. Then, barely audible beneath the chaos, came the soft scrape of boot on gravel just outside their building. James caught Elizabeth's eye in the darkness, signaling for her to remain still. The door latch moved slowly, carefully, as someone tested whether it was locked. Finding it secured, their visitor moved to the window, the shadow of a figure briefly visible against the moonlit glass. James raised his revolver, taking aim, but before he could fire, a voice called softly from outside, Frank Blackwood's distinctive drawl. "I know you're in there, James," the outlaw called, keeping himself carefully shielded beside the window. "You and the Pinkerton woman both. This doesn't have to end badly. Just pass the cipher out and you can walk away." James remained silent, exchanging a meaningful glance with Elizabeth. Every moment Blackwood spent talking was another moment for Morgan's men to deal with the diversionary attack and come to their aid. "What's it going to be, old friend?" Blackwood continued when no response came. "She worth dying for? Some woman you barely know?" The taunt carried a note of genuine curiosity beneath the malice. "I always figured you for a lone wolf, James. Never thought I'd see you risk your neck for anyone, let alone a law woman." Elizabeth's eyes met James in the darkness, the same question evident in her gaze. In the span of 2 days, they had indeed become something neither of them had anticipated. Allies, partners, perhaps even something more. "Last chance, James," Blackwood called, an edge of impatience entering his voice. "The cipher, or I burn you both out." The threat was immediately followed by the distinctive smell of coal oil being splashed against the wooden walls of the building. James tensed, realizing Blackwood's deadly intent. Fire would be catastrophic, not just for them, but potentially for the entire mine complex. Elizabeth had clearly reached the same conclusion, her expression resolute as she moved silently toward the rear window, their only potential escape route. But before either of them could act, the night was split by a single rifle shot, followed by a cry of pain and the sound of a body falling heavily to the ground. "Blackwood's down!" came Morgan's voice from somewhere in the darkness. "The rest of you throw down your weapons. You're surrounded." The chaotic minutes that followed passed in a blur of activity. Blackwood had indeed been shot, though not fatally. Morgan's bullet had struck him in the shoulder, effectively ending his threat. His remaining men, seeing their leader captured and realizing that their diversionary attack had failed, surrendered quickly. Sheriff Mills was among those taken into custody, his face a mask of sullen defiance as Morgan's men bound his wrists. By dawn, the mine yard had been transformed into an impromptu jail, with Blackwood and his accomplices secured in one of the equipment sheds under heavy guard. Morgan had dispatched riders to the territorial capital to fetch federal marshals, as the corruption of the local law enforcement meant justice would need to come from outside Redemption Creek. In the first light of morning, James found Elizabeth standing alone at the edge of the mine property, looking out over the valley where Redemption Creek nestled among the hills. The events of the past 2 days had left visible marks on her, smudges of dirt on her once fine traveling suit, a small cut on her cheek from flying splinters during the gunfight. But she stood straight and composed, her inherent dignity undiminished. "It's over," James said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Blackwood will hang, along with the worst of his gang. The others will serve time. Elizabeth nodded, though her expression remained pensive. The cipher will put an end to their entire network, she confirmed. My employers will be very pleased. The formal reference to the Pinkerton agency hung awkwardly between them, a reminder that their paths had crossed only by chance and circumstance. What happens now? James asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. Elizabeth turned to face him fully, those remarkable green eyes studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away, yet somehow rendered him unable to do so. I return to Denver, she said simply, file my report, receive my next assignment. The practical answer was exactly what he had expected, yet it left a hollow feeling in his chest that he hadn't anticipated. And you? She asked, her voice softening slightly. Will you stay in Redemption Creek? James gazed out over the landscape, the rolling hills, the distant mountains, the small town just beginning to stir with morning activity. This place had been his refuge, his attempt at a new beginning. Now with Blackwood's capture and the exposure of his own past to Morgan and others, everything had changed. I don't know, he admitted honestly. The ranch is... He trailed off, remembering the state in which they had left his small homestead. Door broken in, possessions scattered by Blackwood's men. It could be rebuilt, certainly. But would it ever feel like the sanctuary it once had? More importantly, would he want to return to that solitary existence after these past days of connection, of purpose, of fighting alongside someone who somehow understood both who he had been and who he was trying to become? Elizabeth seemed to read these thoughts in his expression. You could start over, she suggested quietly, somewhere new. The implication hung unspoken between them, that perhaps his fresh start needn't be alone this time. Before James could respond, Morgan approached, his expression serious but respectful. Federal marshals will be here by tomorrow, the mine owner informed them. They'll want statements from both of you. He hesitated, then added, Miss Caldwell, I've taken the liberty of securing accommodations for you in town. And Harker, I've sent men to assess the damage to your property. Whatever repairs are needed, consider it done at the mine's expense. It's the least I can do after what you've both risked. The gesture was unexpected and generous. James nodded his thanks, though his thoughts were elsewhere. As Morgan departed, leaving them alone once more, Elizabeth turned back to the view, her profile outlined against the morning sky. Denver isn't so very far, she said softly, the words barely audible. A few days' ride, when the weather's good. The simple observation carried a weight of meaning that made James' heart beat faster. I've heard it's a growing city, he replied carefully, testing the unfamiliar waters of possibility. Might be a good place for a man looking to make a new start. Elizabeth's lips curved in a small smile, though she kept her gaze on the distant horizon. Pinkerton agents aren't forbidden to marry, you know, she said, the apparent non sequitur catching James completely off guard. Though it's unusual enough that it raises eyebrows at headquarters. The implications of this statement, both what she was offering and what she was asking, left him momentarily speechless. After years of isolation, of deliberately avoiding attachments of any kind, the prospect of such a fundamental change in his life was both terrifying and exhilarating. Elizabeth finally turned to face him fully. Vulnerability and strength mingled in her expression. Too soon? She asked softly, a hint of uncertainty creeping into their voice for the first time since he had known her. James found himself reaching for her hand, the touch no longer shocking, but somehow natural, as though their hands had always been meant to find each other. Not too soon, he said quietly. Just unexpected. The connection between them, forged in danger, strengthened by shared purpose, and now opening into something deeper, felt more real than anything he had experienced in years of wandering. "I need to learn to read properly," he added with the ghost of a smile, thinking of her educated background. "And I've never lived in a city." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around his, her smile widening slightly. "We all have things to learn," she replied, her green eyes alight with a warmth that reached places within him long closed to the world. Standing there in the morning light, with the future suddenly opening before them like an uncharted trail, James Harker realized that the innocence he had sought in his isolated existence had always been a hollow substitute for what he had truly needed. Not the absence of connection, but its presence. Not the numbing of his past, but the possibility of redemption through a future shared with someone who saw him for who he truly was. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, they turned together toward the mine buildings where their statements would be needed, their hands still joined. The journey ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges neither could fully anticipate. Yet in that moment, with her touch connecting them in ways that transcended the physical, James knew with absolute clarity that whatever paths lay before them, they would face them, not as strangers brought together by chance, but as partners bound by choice. A choice that had unveiled secrets long buried and shaken his soul to its very foundations. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.